Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone here in person in our offices in Washington, D.C. in a beautiful spring Thursday. And welcome to everyone participating by webinar as well to our nonprofit group monthly luncheon, understanding new global sanctions and restrictions and how they impact your overseas nonprofit operations. As you are no doubt aware, there are a lot of new developments in this area, and I'm very excited to have a couple of our colleagues here at the firm who are immersed in this issue and have been very helpful and familiar with the nonprofit organizations that we represent and have helped a lot of our clients over the years comply with sanctions issues and just generally helping nonprofits operate overseas. And before I introduce each of them briefly, just a quick plug. Next month, we have a seminar set up. It's Navigating Internal Investigations at Nonprofit Organizations, and that'll be set for May 17th, same time as this one, also available in person and through the webinar. So you should, if you don't have an email invite for that, you should be getting it soon. And when you, I think it's going to go out soon. It hasn't gone out yet. Please do register. And with that, I wanted to quickly introduce my two colleagues. To my immediate left is a partner who has been with the firm for a number of years, and I've known her for decades now, Lindsay Meyer, who's co-chair of our International Trade Practice Group and is led the team for many years on sanctions issues and certainly very well aware of what's going on now with Russia and other countries over there. And another colleague, Neha Dahinza, is an associate in that practice, has been practicing with us, I think, for 6 or 7 years, and is also very knowledgeable on the topic. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Great. Greetings, everybody, and thank you so much, George. I know we have had the good opportunity to present to this group in the past on different issues, and when we got the call earlier this year, they said, "Oh, could you, provide a little bit?" This was pre-February. Could you provide a little update on, what's going on in the trade world that might be of interest to this group? Well, lo and behold, as we all know, February came, and there were significant changes that have been impacting everyone, for-profit, not-for-profit, individuals, companies. So we thought it would only be appropriate to put a little bit of a further flavor to what we're seeing from the context of export controls and putting it in the context of Russia in particular. So the comments that we're going to provide today are more Russia specific because of the situation in Ukraine, but actually it's analogous to what we deal with every day. So as you might imagine, there are a number of sanctions and restrictions programs, all based on trade policy, who we like, who we don't like, from a global standpoint, that is the US, is that we, as I'm speaking. So we're going to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we're seeing and how it may impact your operations as nonprofit organizations. But we'd love for this to be interactive. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or ping us online with a chat question, and we'd be happy to address that. So we're going to give you a little bit of a roadmap today. So we're going to give an overview, kind of a high level, so you understand what agencies are applying these various rules, how they interact, both on the sanctions front and on export controls. We're also going to talk about where we're seeing the rubber meet the road, how it may impact your organization. And then we're going to talk about a couple of recent case studies, because you can't make this stuff up. So hopefully it'll have some resonance with some of the issues that you're dealing with, and of course, Q&A. So just at a very high level, when we talk about export controls and sanctions, so trade controls broadly, there are 3 primary agencies in the United States that deal with these. The first and foremost is Treasury. And at Treasury, there's a particular office, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. So we tend to, fall into DC speak and talk in acronyms. So if we say OFAC, that means the Treasury Department's office that deals with sanctions. And that's it's kind of a lean and mean organization agency here in town. It doesn't have a lot of members in it, but I can tell you they have been working nights and weekends since February, dealing with the issues, and have really been incredible in providing not only updates, but also interpretations and the like. So OFAC is sanctions for the most part. Then when you talk about export controls, there are two. For most nonprofits, you're not dealing in the world of big things that go bang. So most of the products that would be exported, and when I say products, it could be actual items, could be software technology. For most of the exports, most of the things leaving the United States, they're governed by the Department of Commerce and specifically the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. So OFAC, Treasury, BIS, Commerce. And that's where dual use or items that are not defense essentially are governed for purposes of controls that may apply to goods as they're leaving the United States, goods, technology, et cetera. And then the last one is sort of the mother lode, and that's the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, or DDTC, as we like to call it. And DDTC is the organization, that's the agency here in town under the State Department that deals with defense articles. So those are, think traditionally munitions, but actually more expansive than that. Could be biomedical precursors to nuclear, et cetera. So those are the primary US agencies. Now there can be some specific other ones, like there's a segment in Department of Energy, there's a nuclear regulatory, but if we're talking general mainstream sanctions and export controls, those are the three primary agencies. Of course, you also have to think about if you have an office, a branch overseas, that particular country's laws may also apply. So you have to be mindful of what are all the touch points. So we're going to focus predominantly on the US, but clearly, even in the context of the Russian sanctions, there has been a significant amount of activity, certainly from the UN, from the EU, the UK, and other countries. I mean, even Switzerland jumped in the game. So, it's bad when Switzerland is not neutral. So that's just a high level overview of the agencies. And we're going to tick through. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Neha.
All right, so we figured the first thing we would do is go over just who is subject to US sanctions and export controls. So every organization, including nonprofits, that is formed in the US is subject to US sanctions, jurisdiction, and US export controls. Also, US subsidiaries of nonprofits that are, non-US would also be considered US persons for the purposes of being under the jurisdiction of like OFAC and BIS. Then it's US citizens and permanent residents located wherever in the world. So just because a US citizen, flies to Paris, that doesn't mean they can then start doing business with, Iran, say. The jurisdiction follows the citizenship in this case. It's all all foreign persons that are in the United States, including foreign persons. So if you're physically in the United States, you are subject to US sanctions and export controls. And then when it comes to export controls, it's not just being present in the United States, but the jurisdiction follows the item. So if an item is considered US origin, and as Lindsay said, that could be, a good, software, technology, then even when the item leaves the United States, it is still subject to US export controls. So the reach is pretty broad. Some sanctions programs, we call them regimes, like Cuba have, even more expansive jurisdictional reach than the traditional ones. So, non-US companies owned or controlled by US persons, or non-US companies that traffic or like deal in property in previously US owned property that was expropriated by the Cuban government. So all that to say, the reach of sanctions and export controls is quite broad. So we figured we would just give like a quick overview of, as we said, we're focusing a little bit on the Russian sanctions. So most Russian sanctions were, since February, imposed under an executive order that was actually issued back in 2021. But since then, and as I'm sure you've read in the news, they've been steadily increasing them. So, every week you'll hear like a new bank, a new oligarch, a new sector of the Russian economy. So there have been many more executive orders or EOs issued since, including a very recent one which prohibited all new investment in Russia by all U.S. persons, which we're still, trying to figure out what is new investment, what is not new investment, and trying to get more clarity on that. So it's evolving, it changes every week. But generally speaking, OFAC sanctions are sort of fall under three buckets. There's the region and country based ones. So that's in the Russia, Ukraine aspect, that's like, Crimea, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, where those were what we call comprehensive embargoes. All trade is prohibited. So no import or export of services, just absolutely nothing. You see one of those, you like stop the transaction. Then there's sanctions that target specially designated nationals. So those are people that get put on people, entities, organizations, ships sometimes that get put on what is called a specially designated nationals list. It's called the SDN list. And so all transactions with that particular person in the particular region are prohibited. So this is the list that they put Russian oligarchs on, politicians, like big Russian financial institutions, like military and defense, like state-owned organizations and things like that. So that's what the government uses to start putting on the pressure before putting like a complete embargo on the country, which is what you've been seeing. Then there's persons and entities on other lists. There's OFAC issues, what are these so-called directives, and they're not quite embargoes. They're just entities, organizations that they have concerns about and that have ties with like problematic governments or, regimes. And they just want to sort of slowly cut them off from, the international financial system and so we call them the debt equity restrictions. And so, you can't extend debt to them for longer than a certain amount of time, or you can't invest in new equity in these organizations or entities, new investments, things like that. So those are sort of the three tools that OFAC uses in terms of starting off slow and then turning up the pressure and then just going, full embargo, which is only a few regions in the world. As we said, in Ukraine, it's Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And then, there's Iran, Cuba, Syria, North Korea. Sudan.
Game 5.
Yeah, that's true. So U.S. persons and affiliates are prohibited, as noted, from dealing directly or indirectly with SDNs or, engaging in otherwise prohibited transactions in these like embargoed regions. But it's not just direct transactions. There's also a restriction on what is called like facilitation. And we would interpret that so we get a lot of questions often where a client comes up against that are doing business in a sanctioned territory or with an organization or individual that was designated on the SDN list, and they're like, oh, that's fine, we'll just route it through this third party that we have in the country. And that's not okay, not for OFAC. So you can't do via an intermediary or a third party what you can't do yourself. You also cannot help the third party do what you cannot do yourself. So you can't just without any text and an email, just like forward it to your, consultant in a third party, just with the understanding that they will take care of it and deal with the SDN or deal with the sanctioned territory. because the US government considers that facilitation. And, there's a lot of things are covered within the definition of facilitation. US persons can provide insurance, can provide, commercial support, whatever. So yes, basically can't help along one of these transactions and can't just reroute them. There are often what are called general licenses that are issued for each of these sanctions programs, and a lot of time applicable to nonprofit organizations work. So for Russia and Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, I know there's the food and medicine general license. There's like a general license for all activities of the Red Cross. There's a general license for meeting the basic human needs of the people in the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions. So OFAC will often recognizing how important the work of international organizations, especially the humanitarian ones, in these regions, will often issue a general license, sort of permitting them to operate in those regions despite U.S. sanctions. And if they don't issue one, there's also always the option of going in to request OFAC for what is called a specific license. So that's just a U.S. organization writing in, it's just a letter to OFAC saying, this is why we think that we should be allowed to, operate in this region or conduct this particular transaction. And as long as it's sort of aligned with the US's foreign policy objectives, they will often at least review it in good faith, maybe not approve it. This sort of just gives a rundown of, as I mentioned, the comprehensive embargoes versus the lesser restrictions on persons and entities. So, those are the big ones up there where just all transactions are prohibited except the few that are permitted pursuant to, general licenses. Whereas for the ones at the bottom, it's like the opposite way, like not all trade and transactions are prohibited, but a lot of individuals, entities, government-owned entities, officials are on the SDN list. Just a few pointers on compliance. So as we know well recently, sanctions regimes are not unique and not static, and they are changing every day. And at least since I've been working on this team, nothing has been more true than for the Russia sanctions, which truly changed on a daily basis, a weekly basis, sometimes an hourly basis. And so even though that is the case, the onus is on US or organizations or US persons as they are defined to continue to be compliant with them, even though they are changing constantly. Of course, there's some wiggle room and there's some amnesty given by OFAC. They will not bring down the hammer if it's like 2 days late, but all US organizations are expected to stay on top of this. Sanctions violations, as noted, are strict liability offenses. So it's not an oops, I didn't know. It is a compliance obligation to know what the sanctions are and to make best efforts to comply with them. Historically, there was a focus on like commercial entities and operations, but now that has, in recent years, we're seeing that greatly expanded to individuals, foundations, associations, a lot of looking into how are these foundations being funded, what is the work being done, where is the money going? And so there's really a need for sort of enhanced due diligence in compliance, especially for dealings with like international organizations and like international branches, or just international like dealings in general. There's something called the 50% ownership rule. And so, this makes things complicated because not only are US persons prohibited from doing business with entities on the SDN list, but also any entities that are 50% or more owned by an SDN. So, you may have a partner organization somewhere and you're like, all right, we screened them against the list, no matches, we're good to go. Unfortunately, that's like not enough. And there needs to be additional due diligence in terms of who is like the beneficial owner of this organization, who funds this organization, who is like effectively in control of this organization. So all of that becomes implicated when taking into account OFAC's 50% ownership rule. We would recommend when trying to interpret, how the sanctions apply to you, there's OFAC puts out FAQs pretty often, especially every time with the Russia sanctions, as they've been implementing more sanctions and on a weekly basis. They've been putting out FAQs that help the industry interpret those sanctions and those general licenses that they issue. We would say not enough, but they say they're working on it. They're very busy these days. And then, as Lindsay noted, there's always, there's US sanctions, but if you have operations in the UK, in EU, those sanctions also apply and are as similarly broad as US sanctions often. So, it's not just complying with the US, it's also complying with UK and EU. Potential violations, red flags. So this is just sort of a list of the sorts of things that we see that give our clients and us pause and, definitely merit some more investigation. Like the first example is, like the baseline sanctions, I guess, compliance program is just screening all of the names of like international partners against what is called the SDN list and making sure they're not in one of the embargoed regions. You do that, and then the name or address is very similar to a name or address of an entity or an individual on this SDN list. The first thing to do is just like stop the transaction and investigate. There's, as Lindsay was noting, OFAC violations are strict liability. And so, there's no going back and saying, oops, sorry, we knew about it, but we weren't sure. So we went ahead and did it anyway. Instead, it's stop, don't do it, check it out and make sure it's not the same person. And then, you can proceed. Once you do get to that part and you're trying to investigate, like, hey, your name is very similar, or this person or organization partner's name is very similar. Can you provide additional details as to ownership information, a date of birth, so we can, differentiate them? And so that is like the next step that we would really recommend. If the entity in that case or the organization sort of pushes back and says, oh, it's not the same person, don't worry about it, we would recommend that you worry about it. And, oftentimes people are like, oh, why do you need the corporate ownership information? Like, our corporate owners have nothing to do with this, or our funder has no involvement in this organization. We're independent. International entities really should not be pushing back like that. And if they are, it's often, couched in privacy concerns, or, this is overreach pursuant to US law. We always recommend that US organizations like push back and actually get that information, because it is the compliance obligation, it's like, it's your compliance obligation. Like, it doesn't matter to them in the end if a US organization ends up doing business with a sanctioned entity, the repercussions will be to the US organization. Other things that we recommend looking into are really if providing grants or funding to an international organization, it's sort of having like a very good handle or like a plan on how those funds will be spent, and making sure that there's some sort of compliance framework to ensure that the funds were spent how entities told you that they were going to be spent, because in the end, like, again, it's the US organization's compliance organization obligation to make sure that the funds being sent internationally are being spent in a way that is compliant with US law. Another red flag we usually see is when individuals or entities insist on cash payments or unusual payment terms, for example, in the name of a third party. So you're dealing with an international organization and they're like, great, we'll take your grant money. Can you send it to this bank account under a third party name in Dubai? That's a big red flag. And we would recommend stopping it and checking out what the relationship is. Why don't you have your own bank account in where are you actually located? And so same for an individual, an individual like in an international location is, going to do consulting services and then says, send it to my cousin's account in Paris. Like that's a big red flag. So again, those are the sort of things that really merit like stopping and then taking a further look into what's actually going on.
And the beauty is we didn't have to make up this list out of thin air. We've seen all of these. So, as we said before, you can't make this up. I think for nonprofit organizations, you have to think like a commercial organization, frankly. You have to be as astute. Back historically, the government was not pursuing these type of rules and regulations against nonprofits and charitable foundations. That day is long gone. And in fact, the organizations around the globe have gotten a little bit more clever in that, pick a government. There's a lot of activity that's going on in the name of organizations overseas that are really fronts for a government operation. You see that a lot in Iran. You see it in Russia. Russia, though, is more interesting. And this sort of underscores the other point. There are two real things. Like in corporate America, it's know your customer and follow the money, right? Like when it comes down to it, it's business. And you have to almost think that way now. Put on your, corporate America hat and almost be a detective, because the know your customer is challenging just for all of the reasons that Neha just explained. The 50% rule is very hard. And when you're talking about a Russian oligarch who gives the money to his daughter, who opens an account in the Caymans, which is a holding company that opens another one in the Jersey Islands, that then opens one in the Netherlands that's supposedly, a legitimate upfront business. The US government wants you to follow that trail to the extent that you can. So one of the questions that people always ask are, well, how do we do this? Number one, you do your screening to figure out, is there a hit or not? And then you do the search as best you can with publicly available information. Right. So that was sort of the process that we've described. So that's sort of the know your customer, and the obligation now that sits with you as strict liability, meaning you can have good intent, bad intent, doesn't matter. If you tripped over what was prohibited, you've hit a violation. And then on the follow the money front, at the end of the day, that's what drives things. So whether you're sitting in an organization and providing humanitarian relief, you get funds and grants and you issue grants and the like. So that too is where you can hit the tripwire. And if you recall back in slide 1, when I mentioned the program that is organized for sanctions is OFAC, okay, that's fine. But remember, that's part of the Department of Treasury. So follow the money because that's what they like to do. Okay, anyway, sorry for my sidebar. The other piece of it is that you also need to think about export controls. Okay, at this point, you probably want to go off and get a cookie, get a cup of coffee, whatever, and come back because you're like, export controls, what does that have to do with me? I'm not, making big things that go bang. However, it's more important to think about it because the export controls are very expansive. And as I alluded to before, the US government assesses what is controlled based on what they care about. So the US government now cares about a broader range of things. It's not just the stuff that Lockheed Martin makes, right? It can be emerging technology of a bio scientific basis. It can be encryption and AI capabilities. It can be any number of things, but it can also be big things that go bang. So if we're sitting here today and we know that there's a crisis going on in Ukraine, a lot of organizations are looking to try and support them, right? So humanitarian organization, check. What are they providing? Oh, missile rocket launchers? I don't know. So just be mindful of this because it can, in fact, impact nonprofit organizations. So a little bit on export controls. So export controls are just what you think they are. It's the release of something, sending something from the US outside our borders. Okay, that's sort of the traditional. Package it up, give it to the FedEx, off it goes. It also can be hitting the send button on your computer if you've got some software that you're sharing with your organization or on the ground person in pick a country. Or it can be a discussion over technology where you're having maybe you're on Zoom, you pull up your shared screen and suddenly the blueprints are being shared or whatever technical data that is needed. So what type of missile rocket launchers do they need in Ukraine? Well, let's talk about it. Let's pull some up. So all of those can technically be an export. The other thing that can be an export is sharing of technology in the United States. So even sitting in this lovely conference room here in Washington, D.C., if we were to bring in some technical experts from overseas, so non-US persons, and come and have a technical discussion, that would be considered a deemed export. So it's deemed to be an export to, let's say I invited somebody, an engineer from Germany, that would be an export to Germany if we're having a scientific and technical discussion. The other way that you see it commonly on the commercial side is kind of the plant tour. Okay, so what kind of missile rocket launchers are we going to get? Well, let's go down the street and have a tour and see if we like them, kick the tires. I usually say you have to be careful of offering the Disney tour, which is non-export control provision, before you take the next step and have kind of the full on, let's have a full technical discussion. So the exports can arise in many, many different ways, in many different forms. And it's not just limited to commercial organizations. And, I was a little bit flip in some of those, but obviously humanitarian organizations aren't going to be sending rocket launchers. So that was maybe a bridge too far. But anyway, you should have an awareness of think about what you're doing before you take on activity with overseas colleagues, partners, whomever. As I said before, the majority of the exports just globally, if you look at what leaves the United States, the vast majority are under the commerce rules, the export administration regulations, or as we call it, like the EAR. So here we've got, there are particular rules, and if you need to send something overseas, it's worth stopping and saying, what am I sending, and do I need authorization for that? We don't have to get into the details on how to do it and all that good stuff. Okay, so really, the more important part is, okay, this has all been very confusing, a lot of information. I'm afraid to leave my office, right? Is that how we're feeling? So I want to put it in context because this advice will apply whether you're an individual, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a charitable organization. There are really three things that you need to think about, and it's sort of the context of three things. We've discussed it in the Russia-Ukraine scenario, but in every issue that arises, you want to say, number one, are there legal regulatory implications? So am I authorized? Can I legally do what I want to do or what I intend to do, right? That is where, on the example that Neha discussed, when you're sitting here and okay, I know I can't deal with this organization in Iran because it's a front for the government, so no can do, but I'll be like, hey, friend, colleague over in France, I know France has had a long historical relationship with Iran. Maybe they can do it, right? So that facilitation of going, hey, buddies over in France, here's a good opportunity for you, is something that would be a legal violation. So as a regulatory matter, the French organization probably, unless there's secondary sanctions, probably wouldn't be the first call that the US government would make. No. They would make the call to you to say, did you help the French organization deal with the Iranian group? That was your regulatory obligation, right? So that's kind of the primary, that's where you're on the hook. So that's fine. You have that, you've done your screening, you know you can't do that, you take that step. But then you say, all right, but let's see, we have been, let me use a different example. Let's say there's an organization that in 2021 was fine. Let's say they're sitting in the Netherlands, Organization A. Organization A is a Netherlands-based company or organization, nonprofit. Fine, all well and good. January 1 of 2022, they get added to a list. Supposedly behind the scenes, they're a front for somebody bad in the government's perspective. Okay, so that's fine. You've already signed a 2-year agreement with them. Okay, so you are providing cooperative services affiliation with them. Okay, first year, no problem, all good. Sunny skies. January 1, 2022, not good. So then what do? You're sitting here in your office going, okay, I know because I've done my screening, good job, that they are now listed, so I can't deal with them. What does that mean? Okay, so if you can't find authorization or a license, then you're not permitted to go forward. So you're like, all right, I want to follow the US law, so I'm going to just stop. So then you have to think about what's your contractual obligation. So look at the agreement, look at the form that you've signed with this group, this person, these whatever, this entity, to see whether or not there is an ability for you to get out contractually. Again, the US government doesn't care about your contracts. They care about whether or not you're violating the law. So regulatory first, contractual second. If on reviewing your contract, you say, well, there's this force majeure. Okay, is force majeure going to help here? Let's see, there wasn't really an act of God. Maybe, maybe not. So the next thing you look for is there a compliance with laws provision? So if, as you're sitting here today, and it says, thou shalt comply with all applicable laws, be it Netherlands, US, whatever, you're sitting here today, suddenly you're prohibited. It's illegal for you to take this action. So that would give you the opportunity to get out of the contract without being in breach. And then thirdly, the context that you need to be mindful of is policy. And I would say the confluence of these three is no more present than in the issues that we've been advising on over the last couple of months since Russia, right? So we know, for example, Yale University is tracking commercial organizations that are pulling out of Russia, publicizing them, read them in the Times, Post, whatever. So many companies have made the policy decision to get out, right? As a practical matter for their shareholders, their moral, ethical obligation, whatever the decision is, they have made a policy decision to extract themselves from a situation. But before doing that, we would advise, think about one and think about two. So number one, are you legally obligated to get out? Okay, no. So you certainly couldn't rely on a compliance with laws provision under that scenario. Force majeure, depends how it was written. So are you contractually now on the hook with whatever you signed up for your vendors, suppliers, collaborators, partners, researchers, whomever, right? That's where kind of the rubber hits the road. So these, if you remember nothing else, remember this slide and think about those three areas: your legal obligation, legal/regulatory, your contractual obligation, and your policy decision, because those aren't always perfectly aligned. Okay, enough on that. We'll move on. Okay, so we are going to, are any questions on that thus far before we get some examples? Okay. Clear as mud. Oh, George, nice.
Is there a best practice for how frequently a nonprofit or other company should check the SDN list? Like how, and is I would imagine there's software or other things available where they push to you as opposed to you having to pull. Just curious about that.
So that is a really good and hard question to answer. So I'll give it my best shot and then Neha can correct me. My best shot is it depends on your level of activity, and it depends on, let's say you're an organization and you deal with three overseas businesses or collaborators, right? Partners. So you would certainly want to screen them on the time you sign them up. You generally, if you have financial transactions with them, you're paying them, they're paying you, you're giving them a grant, follow the money, check it then. If you have 3, somebody in your office can do that. It's not rocket science. Like, it's hard in making the analysis of 50% rule or not, but doing the initial cut. So you at least want to do that. You at least want to do it annually. Now, if you tell me, oh, we've got 60 organizations around the globe, that would probably not be sufficient, because remember, you not only want to screen the entity organization you're dealing with, but any other ancillary, anyone else in that chain. So what bank are you using? Are you using insurance? Are you using a shipper to send stuff or receive stuff? All of those would need to be screened. So the more volume of touch points you have, the more likely it would be advisable to have screening occurring behind the scenes. So a lot of the programs, again, the more you screen, the more expensive it is. So you have to kind of find that risk reward balance. There are ones that screen, on a daily basis, will run and rerun for updates. So it's sort of, legal answer, it depends, based on the level of activity. Thoughts?
No, absolutely agree with you. I would be overkill for someone who has 3, international partners to go and pay like thousands and thousands of dollars for like a program. But yes, as the number increases, it's definitely a worthy investment. Also, I mean, just in the news, if you see Russia sanctions are escalating, you have a lot of Russian partners, we would recommend you like called and then screen them all.
Screen all those friends,
Yeah.
and then their fathers and sisters and cousins and the like. I mean, it is interesting. We have been, as you might imagine, tracking a number of different issues, and sometimes you see it pop up in the newspaper before it pops up on a list. So that's a really fun early warning bell, and we get to be the one to go to the client. Did you happen to read the New York Times second page, column 4? Yeah, beware. So anyway, on that front, we are going to talk about a couple of examples, and I think, am I up first on this one? We shuffle these around. Why don't you go for it?
Yes. So this example is sort of an arts nonprofit is considering or had a pre-existing relationship with a famous Russian painter and sculptor, and they were supposed to come to the US and create this like beautiful installation. But unfortunately, they are a supporter of one Mr. Putin. And so the nonprofit decides that they want to sever ties with the organization. However, as Lindsay said, that's the policy decision, because they no longer want to be associated with this artist and want this sculpture painting. But they still have contractual obligations to this artist, and so it's the same things that Lindsay was talking about, where, okay, what is the contractual obligation? You have to pay them this amount of money. What, how much? Like, have they completed part of the work? Have they completed all of the work? So once you determine that, then in this case, since the artist is based in Russia, your next problem is, how are you going to get the money there? We would recommend in a scenario like this, first to, screen the artist. Maybe the artist is on an SDN list. Screen the bank of the artist, because a lot of Russian banking institutions were put on the SDN, so like do not touch list. So, if they come back with you with Sberbank, which is one of the SDN banks and one of the biggest banks in Russia, then they're going to have to be requested to provide a different bank account in which the money can be paid. Then as the Russian sanctions sort of escalate, there've been like incremental changes in what transactions are permitted and what transactions are not permitted. So early April, we could have sent a transaction that perhaps by yesterday was no longer permitted. And so there was like an executive order on, for example, banknotes. Like, no transaction of US banknotes can be sent or with the Russian Federation So we were like sitting there reading that saying banknotes, is that just like physical cold hard cash? Is that all US dollar transactions? We have to like wait for OFAC to issue FAQs. And so those are generally just sort of the considerations and like the process that we go through when dealing with a situation like that. And then in the end, it's like, the PR implications of payment, even if legally permissible, which this sculpture was supposed to be this like great big art installation, probably millions of dollars. And so does the organization want to be seen sending, millions and millions of dollars to a supporter of the Russian government, of the Kremlin? And so, is there any way that they can get out of that agreement? So those are the sort of like issues that we deal with, that we would consider when dealing in a situation like that.
So for more fun, let's talk about another one. Okay, so this one has to do with a nonprofit that was supporting a student study abroad program. The nonprofit was based in the US. It had organizations in other countries and also collaborated with France and in Asia, in Taiwan, to send students over to Russia and vice versa. So this has been a collaborative program that's been going on for many years. That's all well and good. The organization that it was dealing with in Russia was the funding came from a particular arm, a particular bank. The bank at the time, or the bank had not been sanctioned itself. The founders, two founders of the bank had been sanctioned. So founders of the bank sanctioned, bank not. Bank provided the funding, seed money to the organization in Russia that this group was collaborating with and had collaborated with. So now things sort of go upside down, the world goes upside down, and they've got students in Russia and Russian students in these other countries. What do we do? And we need the answer by 4. Great. All that time, 2 hours, no problem. So obviously we have to screen everybody. We have to figure out what the ownership is. The ownership, of course, is murky. Were the funders, the original funders who are now restricted, still affiliated with the funding? Is the funding still stemming from the original funders to the bank, to the organization? Big fat question mark there. Number one, money had been prepaid for this next year. So we're sort of in the mid-cycle. So what do we do with the money that's now here? And how can we either compensate for the expenses that have been incurred, including getting the kids back to their respective home countries, et cetera? And then what do we do with the additional funding money that had been paid? So these are all type of issues that you have to untangle. It's a big, ball of yarn, and you have to pull at each string and figure out where it goes. Again, remembering, okay, what's the policy? Are we so closely aligned with this group that potentially could be problematic? Okay, from a PR perspective, policy, what do we want to do? Contractually, what can we do? And then from a legal perspective, what do we do? So as it continued to unfold, then the bank gets restricted. So day 1 of our analysis was fine. Follow up 5 days later, not so fine. Let's quick update coming. And so these are the type of issues that, are being faced on a daily basis. And then, oh, by the way, they also have trademark protection because they've got a fabulous little collaborative logo that includes the US organization and the Russian organization. Well, they don't want that on their website anymore. So that goes down. But are we able to pay maintenance payments to maintain our IP that has been registered over in Russia? Okay, so let's see. That all goes through Ross Patent, which is akin to our USPTO here, US Patent and Trademark Office. Okay, let's check the list. Not restricted. Semicolon, however, all payments to Ross Patent go to the Central Bank of Russia. Let's check. Big fat no, SDN. So just as recent as yesterday, OFAC provided some oral guidance because, as you might imagine, intellectual property protection in Russia of many, many US, European, et cetera, organizations have been in this limbo. And so the oral advice out of OFAC was that, yes, you can make maintenance payments. There is a general license that permits day-to-day operations, again, if provided they're not otherwise, illegal. So that piece is fine, and the payment can be made to an otherwise designated bank because of this general license. So in fact, you don't have to lose, your IP does not have to lapse. You can pay it. But the authorization only runs through June 23rd, 2022. So hang on, because more updates might be coming. So these are kind of the practical challenges that organizations are facing, and they are keeping us very, very busy. Now, going back to the example with the students, remember, I didn't just say US, but we also had to consult France, Taiwan. So there are other obligations. And it's interesting because all of the sanctions programs are unique. So when I say that, I want that to sink in, because if you're comparing the sanctions program regarding Russia versus the sanctions program regarding Iran, different, similar, but distinct. Likewise, in the UK, similar programs, but different. So when we talk about the 50% rule, remember, we've got to screen and figure out who owns this organization. Are they listed? In the US, it's a 50% ownership rule. Okay, full stop. When they hear the 50% rule, it means 50% owned. So majority owned. In the UK, it's majority owned or controlled. So then you also have to look, well, maybe they don't own it, but is it kind of a wink, wink, I don't own it, but I'm telling you who's doing what. So then there's the control factors. So you have to stop and think about each geographic area that you're in and the sanctions and restrictions that can apply. It's very, it's fun because it's a big puzzle, but it's very complicated. Okay, so moving on to a little more mundane one, shall we? We need to take a bit of downshift, as we say. So this is another example. A lot of times you see conferences, right? Organizations, nonprofits run conferences all the time. Scientific, bring in research engineers to speak. Can you pay them? Can you not pay them? What are they saying? How much are they saying? Are they going to say more than kind of marketing level? Then it might be export controlled. So let's say you're running a fabulous conference, and it's in the United States, and one of the requested attendees is an Iranian employee of an EU company. So Iranian employee of a French company. They want to come attend. You're running this fabulous program where all these brilliant minds and scientists are coming together to explore, Okay, so can you? Number one, you'd want to screen the individual. This gets into kind of how that person is qualified, right? And I don't mean qualifications of PhDs or I mean, how in the eyes of the US government are they perceived? Me sitting here today, I was born in the United States, I'm a US citizen. So these rules follow me everywhere. But let's say I'm a US citizen and maybe I also became an Israeli citizen, right? So I have now dual citizenship. The US doesn't make you renounce one or the other. So how in the eyes of a dual citizen would I be perceived? And there are different rules that apply, as you might imagine. So in this example, if it's an Iranian employee, but the Iranian is a permanent resident in France now and has been for 20 years, they would be considered a resident of France. On the other hand, if the Iranian employee, let's say, for example, was not an employee of a European company, but was a resident in France, but working for a hospital, let's say, affiliated with Iran, that person would be, it would be a state-owned enterprise, and the person would be considered a state employee. So the answer might be different, right? So you have to think about screening the individuals and assessing whether or not there's a restriction that would apply to that person. Again, think about who they are and think about what's the lineage back. Now, sometimes people say, well, are we permitted to even ask these questions? So to that, I would go back and say, well, you have strict liability, meaning you have to comply with the US law. So if you can't answer the question affirmatively to say, yes, they're authorized to come, then they probably shouldn't come, I'll say. And then you also have to give some consideration. A lot of times people who are attending the conference, they say, well, I need a letter of introduction. So how far do you go as an organization to allow them to come? Usually you would, if your intent is, okay, that's fine, we screen them, they're fine, but we want them to come, they need to get a visa, you would authorize it for the time that they're here. And let's say it's one of the professors who's going to be a speaker on your panel, right? So then what do? Do you pay for them to come? Do you pay a stipend for them? Can they bring their family? Can they go to Disney World after? Like all of those considerations, you want to kind of bring the scope right back down to covering reasonable expenses for the professor who's going to speak, not the family, not the kids, no trip to Disney World. Sorry. You want to kind of bring it back down to where the authorization is appropriate. And the sponsorship as well. You want to sponsor them and put in the dates, put in the reason, put in his role, put in, the agenda, etc. And then finally, you also want to think about, is there any transfer of technology that might occur, particularly at scientific organizations and conferences? We've had one recently in the 5G space, right? This is going to a different set of rules and regulations, but in the 5G space, obviously there's a global interest in enhancing and in elevating the capabilities there, but there are also restrictions that apply, for example, against China, and in particular against particular organizations in China that restrictions apply. So, you have to take a step back and think about, who's coming, what are they doing, how long are they doing it for, and how's the money going? So these are just examples that we have actually lived. So can't make this up. But they give you a little bit of a flavor of, we can talk about it in theory. Okay, here are all these sanctions, here are all these rules. Okay, that's well and good, but put it in real terms. So these are just a couple of ones that we've seen. We can stay here all afternoon and tell you more, but we won't, because I think we're getting on the hour. So at that point, I will just hit pause and see if you have questions. Yes.
Hi. In that last example, when you were talking about registration fees, I couldn't quite tell which direction the money was going, but it made me think about another dynamic in nonprofit organizations, which is receiving donations. And I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about sanctions rules relating to receiving money and what types of compliance policies nonprofits adopt relating incoming funds?
Perfect. Right. So if everybody, just to make sure you've heard it, the question was with regard to incoming funds into an nonprofit organization, what do we need to do there? The good news and the bad news all wrapped in one on sanctions restrictions are that they go both ways, right? So they're transactional based. So whether you're paying or whether you're receiving or whether you're attempting to pay, they're all within the same boat. And it raises actually an excellent point, because while organizations are trying to do all this tracking and screening, and it's your head could spin, the heads of the individuals who are doing the tracking and screening over at the financial institutions and banks, their heads are spinning a lot faster than any of ours, right? So if you can imagine the screening that's going on just in organizations, the banks have supersized that. And the reason is because if a transaction is attempted, so let's say you're dealing with your organization, you want to receive monies for your organization, and the funding is coming from Botswana, and it's going to go to the local bank in Botswana, and they're going to, the corresponding bank is, let's say, Citibank, I'm just making this up, Citibank, and then it's going to land in your account. Sounds great. Bring on the money. The problem is, if in fact the organization that is identified is listed, then you can't do business this way or that way, right? You can't give, you can't receive, and you can't even attempt. So if in fact they say, we're going to wire the money and you haven't done your screening, it'll hit Citibank and they'll be like, wait, time out. And they will then come ask you, so what's the nature of this gift? What's the nature of the funding? If in fact the party that was giving it, the grantor, is listed, then the next question would be, well, do you have a license? Maybe you do. If you're an international organization, perhaps there is a general license that applies to the humanitarian activities that you're undertaking. Perhaps you have a specific license. Good question, but thank you. We already went to OFAC and got our approval. If, on the other hand, you say, wow, that's a really good question, I have no idea, probably not a good answer, because OFAC will be on the other receiving end of the call from Citibank saying, hey, guess what? Organization ABC just tried an attempted transaction. And they, if they don't report, they then are in violation, the bank. So hence, why they're so on top of things. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any others? Voila. All right. Thank you so much for your time today, everybody, in person and in the
Don't
air.
forget to register for next month's program too.
Yeah, next month's program, May 17th. And it's going to be a good one, actually, navigating internal investigations at nonprofits. I've been involved in a couple international ones. It's fascinating. Definitely be sure and sign up for that one.